Identify what your goal is. If your goal is to get to as many listeners as possible and as many listens as possible, you probably don't have to be super, super, super niched. The reason people like buffets is because you can get a lot of food for cheap. That appeals to certain people. Maybe one of the reasons you're not getting the success that you want is because you haven't niched down enough yet. I think the uncomfortable truth about niching down is we all probably could do a better job. Clarity is the answer I would suggest for this, because in order to get to where you want, you got to know where you want to go in the first place. Podcast Growth Nation, welcome back to another episode of Podcast Growth University, where we talk all things podcasting all of the time. I hope you enjoyed last week's episode, and if you didn't, if you didn't listen to it, make sure you go check it out. Episode number 141, 3 big reasons you're not guesting on more shows, so other podcasts. Today, for episode number 142, the uncomfortable truth about niching down. Niching, however you say it. I say niching. I did a podcast speech yesterday. So we have a client who works with a bunch of coaches and dietitians and personal trainers and a bunch of people that are service-based entrepreneurs. And she asked if I would come in and talk about the benefits of podcasting. And I said, sure, love it. And one of the questions I got asked was, how important is it for you as a podcaster, or anybody here who wants to be a podcaster, to niche down and be very specific? And I said, well, it always ends up being a conversation of, do you want a bigger piece of a smaller pie, or do you want a smaller piece of a bigger pie? So what does that mean? Well, if you are a podcast that has cool conversations with cool people, that gives you exposure to a potentially fairly large audience, but you'll most likely get a smaller piece. If you are a podcast where you have cool conversations with parents, that's going to be a smaller pie, but you might get a bigger piece of it because there's not that many people doing it. That's the thought process. And I think the other thing that's super important to understand is it really depends on what your goals are. So I have somebody I've been working with for like 4 years now. They're 360 or 370 episodes in. And they started off pretty open. They weren't super specific. They were talking a lot about mindset. They were talking a lot about happiness. They were talking a lot about family and that type of stuff. And as they have grown and as their goals have changed, they have been way more specific in their area of expertise. So this person they sold their practice, but they had one of the top orthodontic clinics in the Northeast of the US. So now they're talking about dentistry and orthodontics and people in that space, service providers. They said, what do you think of me niching down? And I said, 1, prepare yourself for most likely far less listens, because some of the people that are listening aren't going to listen anymore. But I would expect that you will have a far better listener base in terms of alignment. So this is a good example. We have a client who came to us, and they started out as a podcast that was just going to have cool conversations about entrepreneurship and business. And I said, all right, cool. What's the end goal? They said, well, the goal isn't really to make money. I just want to have cool conversations. I said, all right, cool. I would keep doing it that way. Then they came to me a couple months later and said, all right, honestly, now that I know what's possible, I think I would actually like to monetize. What do you think? And I said, well, right now, the problem is you're a contractor and you've been doing it for a long time and you can coach people on how to build a successful contracting business. But how many of your current listeners are actually contractors? So now, not only is it a very small percentage of your people who are contractors, it's going to be an even smaller percentage of them that end up working with you. I would do a complete rebrand and talk about that. Yes, you will have a smaller pie, but you will get a bigger piece of it. And the pie will be something that you like better anyway. So the downside is you're talking to less people. The upside is you're talking directly to the people that you want to talk to. Now, if your goal is purely listens, I don't think niching matters as much because you're not really caring about conversion. If you're just caring about listens, I feel like you would be pretty good being wide. If you care about conversion and you care about monetizing through coaching or products or services, I think niching is a requirement. Just because if you solve everybody's problems, you don't solve anybody's, really. There's too many other places people could go. So this is a good example. My other podcast, Next Level University, is not niched enough. And there is a giant downside to that. But we're okay with it. Right? We're totally fine with that. This show has been surprisingly easy to grow. Why? It's super niched. There aren't that many podcasts about podcasts. I've had other clients who are super niched, and there aren't that many podcasts about what they're talking about roofing or whatever it is. The audience is much smaller, but the audience is looking for a podcast like yours. So it makes life a little bit easier. I know it can be scary. I know there's uncertainty around it, but if you are looking to turn your podcast into a business, I am willing to bet niching is probably a good example or a good idea for you. And we can think about it from kind of like a restaurant standpoint. I love Five Guys Burgers and Fries. Big fan. They do burgers and fries really well. I mean, yeah, they have hot dogs and shakes and stuff like that, but I can't imagine getting other stuff there. They have branded themselves. They have niched themselves. If you don't like burgers and fries, you're most likely not going to go to Five Guys. But if you love burgers and fries, it's way better than McDonald's. It's way better than Burger King, right? That type of stuff. In-N-Out Burger for my West Coast U.S. people. Unfortunately, I'm East Coast, and there's no In-N-Outs here yet. But what do? Burgers, fries, and shakes. I don't even think they have anything else. I mean, yeah, they have their secret menu items, but they're not going to be doing ham and cheese sandwiches. They're not going to be doing Chinese food. They're not going to be doing pizza. That's not their business. Domino's, pizza. They have some other items, but if they just had those items, they wouldn't be Domino's. I think that's a good example. Now, the Cheesecake Factory is an anomaly because it has too many menu items, and they're all pretty freaking good, and they have every cheesecake under the sun there, so they're kind of an anomaly, but I'm willing to bet if other people tried to do it the same way that they did it, it might not fare as well. Now, if they just had cheesecake, and it was just a bakery, that would be different, right? They're super successful, and they're crushing it. I'm not entirely sure how they're doing it. I haven't done enough research to know how. But the reason people like buffets is because you can get a lot of food for cheap. That appeals to certain people. But if you wanted to spend $150 on a meal, you're not going to go to a buffet necessarily. You're going to go to somebody who specializes in where you're going and what you're looking for. So maybe you'll go to a steakhouse if you love steak. Maybe you'll go to a very fancy Italian restaurant if you're looking for pasta. Right? That type of stuff. So it can be scary for sure, but I do think that most people aren't niched enough. And again, yeah, we can look at some of the top podcasts, and Joe Rogan isn't really niched at all, even though now he kind of is getting more niched. And some of these other big shows aren't. But just because they're successful does not mean that's what made them successful. It's just important to put that out there. It's the old causation, correlation, causation thing. Yeah, they're super successful, but it's easier to get big guests when you are a big name and you have connections and you're already somewhat famous. It makes life a little bit easier, right? So I think understanding the difference between an indie podcast and like a Hollywood podcast, those are very, very important things to understand. And I could do an episode on that at some point. But a lot of these shows have a lot of money behind them to be put into things that indie podcasters don't. Again, this is our full-time business, but I don't have hundreds of thousands of dollars to put into, getting guests every year. That gets expensive very, very quickly, or connecting with the right people or that type of stuff. I mean, there's a lot that goes into that. So I just think it's dangerous to try to replicate what we're seeing in really big shows. Now, I'm not saying it can't work for you. I'm not saying you can't do it that way. But out of the hundreds of podcasts I've worked with, 99% of them have gotten better opportunities the more they niched. I've used this client as an example many times. Super niched. Very, 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 very niched. Was making money essentially the first week she dropped her podcast. Now, she's an expert in her field. She knows her audience really well, but it's super niched. She's most likely not going to have 1 million listens anytime soon. She's not. She's not going to have 1 million listens anytime soon. But she has a really loyal listenership that tunes in every week because they essentially know exactly what they're going to get, and she's doing it better than most other places are. So she will reap the benefits of that.
Hey, I wanted to give my experience working with Kevin and the rest of the Next Level University team. It has been such a seamless relationship. He is so easy to work with, Kevin, and he gives you all the information you need, but doesn't overwhelm you. He's also meets you where you're at. So whatever you want to do, he'll make it work. And it's just, there's no stress, there's no drama. And everybody else that I've worked with has been patient with me because I am not technologically savvy. So they've been helpful and patient and just encouraging. And it's just been a fantastic experience. I highly, highly recommend working with them.
So I think the uncomfortable truth about niching down is we all probably could do a better job. I mean, our other podcast is Life, Love, Health, and Wealth. That's not niched at all, really. If we just did mental health, that would be different. I'm not qualified for that, so that's why we're not doing it. If we just did how to make more money and be a more successful business, we would probably have a different level of success. And then if we just talked about relationships, that would be different too, because we would attract a different audience. So if we just talked about business, it might be easier to monetize because business owners are usually willing to pay for business success. Cool. If we were going to be talking about relationships, we would probably want to do it differently and maybe have guests on, and maybe occasionally my wife would come on and my business partner's partner would come on. That would be different. And if we were going to be talking about like health and bodybuilding, that would be completely different. Everything would be different. The branding would be different. Everything, every single thing that we do would be different. And then you can imagine the community would be different and the episodes would be different, right? So I know it's scary to do it, but the uncomfortable truth, I guess another uncomfortable truth, is maybe one of the reasons you're not getting the success that you want is because you haven't niched down enough yet. And if you're trying to talk to everybody, it's really hard to talk to your people because you kind of get lost. I use this example in group coaching. I have 3 slides. One is your podcast is talking to parents. The next one is your podcast is talking to single parents. The next one is your podcast is talking to mothers. Those podcasts are similar, but they're niching down throughout, and the conversation is going to be completely different. I know it's scary to think this, but I would rather somebody hear your podcast for the first time and say, hell no, because I think that creates the opportunity for the people on the other end to say hell yes, honestly. But I also understand it's very scary. So I would say I want to do a better job of giving tactical takeaways on these episodes. I would say the takeaway for this is, 1, identify what your goal is. If your goal is to get to as many listeners as possible and as many listens as possible, you probably don't have to be super, super, super niched. You could just have really powerful conversations with people, do a really good job of naming those episodes, do a really good job of putting out high quality social media clips from it, all that stuff. But it might be hard to monetize. Yeah, you could do the sponsorship ad route, right? You could do that. But again, my belief is that's not where most of the money is for most of us. Don't fall into the Joe Rogan trap. I know he got paid a ton of money, but he has billions of views and it's different. We're all playing kind of a different game. So that's that. The other thought is, if you say, well, honestly, I'd like to be able to turn this into something that's profitable, I would get super niched, and then I would figure out exactly what your offer is, and then how do you help the listeners at a deeper level. But those are two very different models. One is essentially the guest ladder, and one is essentially the listener ladder. The guest ladder is when you go from a D level to a C level to a B level to a B level to a B plus, and then eventually maybe you're having A level guests in your space on, depending on what your space is. A listener ladder is when you're really trying to add value to the listener, and you're trying to get the listener to self-identify, because the listeners are going to be the long-term clients or buyers, I guess, for lack of better phrasing. But those are two very, very different models. One model, you're going to spend a lot of time talking to your audience. The other model, you're going to spend a lot of time trying to find guests. Because this is the thing. These are the guests that you're going to have to like track down emails and track down PR people and assistants and all that stuff and network. So it's just a little bit of a different game. So if you're somebody who is a coach or whatever it is, niche for sure. If you're somebody who says, look, honestly, for me, it's not about the money, it's about having really cool conversations, then I think you'd be good not niching, but there is a downside to both, for sure. There is a downside to both. Again, I think we would be way more successful if we were more niched. And this is a good example of that. I haven't put a ton of time into promoting this podcast because it has grown way better than I expected, honestly. And I think just one of the reasons is I'm getting a bigger piece of a smaller pie. But if this was like an entrepreneurship podcast, that's a really big pie, and I'm going to get a very small piece. There just aren't that many podcasts about podcasts. We just think of the numbers, right? So essentially at that point, it's just kind of a numbers game. And the other thing is, how many podcasts actually get to 142 episodes? That's a smaller number. How many podcasts about podcasts get to 142 episodes? I'm willing to bet that niche, the average amount of episodes that gets reached is way higher than average. Because if you're a podcaster talking about podcasting, you kind of got to podcast very consistently if you're going to lead by example. So even in that, you can see how this niche is drastically different than maybe another niche that I would be in. Also, take a drink every time I say niche. I should have said that at the beginning of the episode. Whatever that drink is, coffee, maybe you're ripping a whiskey while you're listening to this. Who am I to judge? Who am I to judge? So yeah, tangible takeaways, figure out what matters most to you. Is it listens? Is it getting big guests? Okay. Is it converting and making money? Okay. Those could be two very, very different paths. Now, big guest should be in quotes because it also depends on who you are and what industry you're in. So if you're super niched, we'll do this. I've done some consulting with a podcast that is all about building and architecture. And they're super niched. I mean, that is a very, very niche show. But it also means that the guests that they're going to have access to might be pretty high-level guests because they're well-known in the industry and there aren't that many podcasts doing it. But they're just not going to have a ton of listens just because the market size is just not that big. So by niching, they're creating the opportunity for collaboration with guests. They're creating the opportunity for monetization with listeners. They're creating the opportunity for high-level guests, but they're probably not going to scale a ton in terms of listens, right? That's the thought. You can check off a lot of boxes in the way you're doing it. It just might not be realistic to check off all of them. That's my 2 cents. So clarity. Clarity is the answer I would suggest for this. Because in order to get to where you want, you got to know where you want to go in the first place. And sometimes it's really hard. And I know I've seen a lot of people who they forget they forget how unniche they are, because it's easy to fall into the vacuum or the silo of, okay, either everybody has a podcast like mine or nobody has a podcast like mine. It's very easy to fall victim to that. I'll have to try to find it. I don't know if I linked it in a previous episode. I know I said the link, but I did an episode on, it was like, how saturated is your category? Let me see if I can find it really quick. Are you in the right category? It was episode number 97. I don't know if I linked it in the show notes, but I'm pretty sure I said where I found the graph. But there was a graph that talked about, it broke down the percentage of podcasts within each category. So 7% are in this category and 15% are in this category, and boom, 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 boom. I think society and culture is the most saturated category. Again, it doesn't mean you can't win, but is there a way that you could niche more within that category? That is what we're talking about here today. All right, cool. If you are a podcaster who is looking for more tactics, a deeper dive into what works and what doesn't, and you feel alone because you're the only podcaster maybe that you know, or the only podcaster that you talk business with, you don't have somebody to pitch and catch with, our 18th group of group coaching is starting on April 15th, I believe. So it ends up being 12 sessions total over the course of 3 months. The first session is level up yourself. So we talk about mindset, consistency, habit tracking, that type of stuff. The next week is a connection session where we kind of just meet to make sure that you have all your questions answered. And then the next session is also level up yourself. Then the next two are level up your podcast. And then the final two are level up your business. So if you're somebody who really wants to take your podcast and turn it into a full-time business thing, really good opportunity. And it's super affordable based on how much you're getting. I think it ends up being, it's $147 a month for the 3 months. And you get 4 calls per month, and you get direct WhatsApp access to myself, Alan, Amy, our assistant coach. It's really, really affordable based on what you're getting. Again, as a podcaster, I understand how hard it is to make money with a podcast. So the last thing we want to do is say, oh yeah, that's $1,500. No, it's $147 a month for 3 months. You can pay as you go. And if you don't find value, we are more than happy to give you your money back, but I'm sure you will. So we can have the link in the show notes for that. Again, very rarely will I ever talk about anything money involved unless I very, very, very much believe in it. All right, I'm never going to have sponsors. That's never going to be a thing. I'll never run anybody else's ads. That'll never be a thing. I do very much believe in group coaching because it's really what I wanted when I started podcasting. It's like, if I could have a group of podcasters and I would have enough knowledge to help them, that would be the coolest thing ever. So I'll have the link in the show notes for that. And as always, I am happy to do a free 30-minute podcast breakthrough session with anybody listening. I don't care if you just started. I don't care if you haven't even started yet, and maybe you need help going there. All good. I'm not going to sell you anything. It's not a sales call. It is literally me trying to add as much value as I can. And it helps me because I learn about what people are struggling with, and then I can bring that back here to help more podcasters with maybe an issue that you think you're alone in. So I have the link in the show notes for that as well. I hope the weather is warming up depending on where you are in the world, and you're able to feel good about that. That's definitely helpful. I hope your listeners are self-identifying. I hope you are in the right category, and I hope now after this episode you know a little bit more about niching than you did when you came today. All right, keep on crushing it, keep on podcasting, and I will talk to you all next week.